A studious sister comes up to you after the meeting on Sunday and says, "Now, I know that there have always been anointed ones on the earth for the last 1900 years, but recently we said that there has not been a faithful and discreet slave providing spiritual food at the proper time during the last 1900 years. Now, what's the thinking behind that? Why did we change our view on that?" Well, we're waiting. How would you answer? Let's consider four factors. First of all, spiritual food. What is the source of spiritual food? It's the Bible. Now think back over the last 1900 years. What do we know about the Bible? Well, first of all, up until about 1455, more or less, there were no printed copies of the Bible. And the Bibles that existed then were hand-copied, very valuable, very expensive, and very rare. So how would someone have access to the spiritual food? And even so, most of the Bibles were in Latin, and most people in Europe could not read Latin. In fact, historians tell us that until about the year 1000, even the kings of Europe, some of the kings of Europe, could not read, period. So if you couldn't read, if you had little access to the Bible, or if you didn't know Latin, how would you get access to the spiritual food? Even some of the Catholic clergy didn't do very well in their Latin studies. And so they memorized the Mass, more or less. And on Sunday, they would sort of repeat what they had memorized, for better or worse. And sometimes they would just fake it because they couldn't remember the words. So where was the source of the spiritual food? It's not surprising that most of the Protestant reformers had originally been Catholic priests because they were the ones who had access to the Bible and could read it for themselves. So the source of the spiritual food, that's one thing. But now, let's say you're in the 1600s, 1700s. Now you have access to the Bible. But what about the attitude of the reformers toward the Bible? It was really very little difference between the attitude of the Protestant reformers and the Catholic Church. Many of the Protestant reformers took from the Bible what pleased them and rejected the rest. Martin Luther called the Epistle of James an epistle of straw. And he really didn't like the letter to the Hebrews. And the reason? Well, Paul's writings and James' writings didn't go along with some of his ideas. And so he rejected those books of the Bible. Another thing that's important is that Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and Wycliffe all believed in predestination, that God has set out in advance who's going to go to heaven and who's going to go to hell. Well, you say, so what? We'll get to so what in a minute. It's important. It's very important. So the attitude, the source of spiritual food was not always available. The attitude of some who had access to the Bible was not always the best. Now here's the third point, division. There was tremendous division among the reformers because they didn't all accept just what the Bible says, but they had their own ideas and gave their own ideas priority over what the Bible says. Then they didn't all think in agreement. There wasn't just two watches. There were several watches, and they all had different times. For example, the use of images. Luther wasn't terribly opposed to that. Zwingli was. The Lord's evening meal. Luther was almost a Catholic in his view of the Lord's evening meal. He said, well, yes, the bread and wine do become the body and blood of Christ, but it's just not a sacrifice of a Mass. Zwingli, on the other hand, said, no, they're symbols. They just represent the body and blood of Christ. Infant baptism. There was a real furor over infant baptism among the reformers. Many of the reformers said, well, we know we can't support the idea of infant baptism from the Bible, but it's been practiced for a long time, so we're going to go along with it. And what if you didn't? The Anabaptists insisted on immersing adults. So what did the reformers and their supporters do? They arrested them, they tortured them, and then they said, "You want immersion? We'll give you immersion." And they took them out in the middle of the river and immersed them until they died. Now, this wasn't done by the Spanish Inquisition. These were the Protestant reformers who were at the throats of other Protestants. We understand that when Henry VIII began burning English evangelicals, the German evangelicals rejoiced. They thought they had it coming to them because they didn't quite believe the same. Anne Boleyn, you remember Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII? She was beheaded. Well, one of the things that led to her downfall was the fact that the Church of England, supposedly Protestant, learned that she was a secret evangelical and she was supporting the printing and distribution of the Bible. And so they helped bring her downfall. Then there was the name calling. Heathen, dog, pig. That was one reformer talking to another. So we have the source. We have the attitude toward the Bible. We have the tremendous division among the reformers. But now, what attitude would you expect a faithful and discreet slave to have toward the preaching work? Well, strangely, at first it was the Catholic Church that took the commission to preach in all the world more seriously than the Protestant reformers did. Think back on your high school history classes. Who brought the gospel into China? Who tried to convert the Native Americans? Who ventured into the Amazon? Not the Protestant reformers, not at first. It was the Catholics. Now, one historian writes, the reformers were not convinced either of the value or of the necessity of foreign missionary work. Martin Luther thought that the Muslims were irreclaimable and that the Jews could never be converted. Well, now, why did the Protestants feel that way about foreign missionary work? It brings us back to, so what? They believed in what? Predestination. That God has already determined who's going to heaven and who's going to hell. Not only that, but which nations are going to heaven and which nations are going to hell. So why bother to preach? We could get infected with that attitude ourselves. God will never allow any good person to die at Armageddon, so I don't need to preach. Well, the point of this discussion is not to malign these men. We don't know how Jehovah felt about them. We don't know whether any of them were of the anointed, but just had a few problems in understanding. In the early years, we've had problems in understanding. But the point is this. If you take a good, unvarnished look at history, you just do not see a faithful and discreet slave providing food at the proper time. First of all, in the beginning, the source was not available. Next, the attitude toward the spiritual food was not always wholesome. Then there were divisions, tremendous divisions among the reformers, and finally the attitude toward the preaching work. It was a start, but there was no 1900-year-old slave.